Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm Robert Litvak, Senior Vice President of the Wilson Center. Our president, Jane Harmon, is out of town and sends her greetings for today's 6th annual Swiss Day at the Wilson Center. A particularly warm welcome to Ambassador Martin de Hinden. It has been a great pleasure to work with you during your time in Washington. We hope as your appointment as ambassador draws to a close, you'll continue to stay in touch with us in the future. I would also like to extend a sincere welcome to Andreas Kellerhals, Director of the Europa Institute at the University of Zurich, co-host of today's event. Without the partnership of our good friends at the Swiss Embassy and the Europa Institute, Swiss Day would not be possible. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan, public-private policy forum chartered by the U.S. Congress to serve as this country's official memorial to our 28th president. We tackle global issues through independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas. In these politically polarized times, the Wilson Center provides safe political space for addressing key public policy issues. Each year, we welcome 2 Wilson Center Swiss scholars to Washington. While in residence, these Swiss scholars contribute in both policy-relevant scholarship and discussion to the Wilson Center community. We've had the distinct honor to have hosted 16 Swiss scholars at the Wilson Center in the last 5 years. Excuse me. Today's event will focus on a global challenge, cyber threats and better efforts to secure against them that continues to cause economic loss for businesses, endangered lives, as in the series of recent ransomware attacks on city and hospital systems, and risks nation-state escalation and miscalculation if not calibrated carefully. This isn't a problem that can be solved by one country, and some of the leading cyber nations are themselves responsible for a few of the most sophisticated malware tools now leaked on the surface internet. Our discussion will start with keynotes on the European and U.S. perspectives, followed by a panel discussion about how to build a global collective defense. Once again, special thanks to our colleagues at the Europa Institute and the Swiss Embassy, without whose partnership today's event would not be possible. Ambassador de Hinden, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, today is the 5th and last time I'm attending the Swiss Days at the Wilson Center as the ambassador of Switzerland to the United States. I would like to thank the Wilson Center and its outstanding staff for the excellent cooperation. I have always felt welcome on your premises. Let me also give my heartfelt thanks to Professor Andreas Kellerhals of the University of Zurich, my alma mater as well, and to his devoted colleagues. Your visits in Washington have always been special. We had dinners, for instance, with Supreme Court justices like Antonin Scalia, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, or Anthony Kennedy at the residence. These are discussions I will always remember. Both the United States and Switzerland have a knowledge-based economy. They generate wealth primarily by creating and using knowledge, which means working with and combining data. The digitalization of the economy and society is opening up possibilities beyond the imaginable. And both our countries have the capability and the spirit to cross new frontiers, not only for themselves, but for mankind. Obviously, safe data and its protection are paramount to success. It does not come as a surprise that cybersecurity was on the agenda when Secretary of State Pompeo was meeting with our Foreign Minister, Federal Councillor Cassis in Switzerland just last weekend. The concern for cybersecurity shouldn't put us in a spirit of fearfulness. in a defensive or even risk-averse attitude. A Swiss poet once wrote, "The hedgehog should be the heraldic animal of Switzerland." I would certainly disagree with this statement when it comes to the cybersphere. Cyberspace is everywhere. Despite the importance of national legislation and national cyber defense action, international cooperation is pivotal for success, as are new approaches. It will not be possible just to copy-paste existing concepts that have proven suitable in other areas. This is why, as part of our national strategy for the protection against cyber risk, Switzerland takes concrete measures against cyber risks, including with a focus on research and development to assess the new threats. I'm excited to listen today to such outstanding Swiss and American experts, practitioners, and masterminds. Thanks to you all for having accepted the invitation. The topic of cybersecurity is also important to me as a bridge into my future activities. Once I have retired from the Swiss diplomatic service, I will begin teaching security policy at the University of Zurich. I am grateful to the Wilson Center, the Europa Institute, and all our partners here for creating opportunities to explore such rich areas of Swiss-American cooperation during my time in Washington. Thank you very much for your attention. And I give now the floor to Andreas Kellerhals. Please, Andreas.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I may say, thank you very much, Martin. We started this project some 5 years ago, I would say, some 5-6 years ago, to put Switzerland a little bit for once a year on a perspective here in Washington, D.C. So we created the Swiss Day, and we could also do that in cooperation with the Wilson Center, which has been a wonderful cooperation. We look back to five great years, and we look forward to many more years to come. I think the initiative to do that, to create a spot where we talk here in Washington about common issues of common interests, mainly came from Martin Dahinden. And without you, this thing wouldn't have happened at all. The cooperation was always wonderful, interesting. I would always say we started a real deep friendship. And we will miss you sadly on this event, but we are looking forward to cooperation in other spheres and in other areas, maybe back in Zurich. So the Scholar program we have is something that is to a great importance to us, what we can offer. We advertise this every year in Switzerland and invite everybody who wants to join to come for 4 months to Washington, have access, what they always like, access to the Library of Congress, have this wonderful, stimulating environment here, and they always come back very much enriched and very, very happy about this time they have spent here. So I would like to thank the Wilson Center for all the support. Martin, once again, thank you so much for everything you did for this conference and for Switzerland here in the United States. You were, in my view, the best ambassador we ever had. Thank you so much. So, very briefly, and now we have the keynote speaker of today, André Kudelski, the CEO of Kudelski AG and the president of INNOSUISSE. Please, Mr. Kudelski.
So, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great honor and pleasure to talk to you today. But I will maybe first have some thoughts to President Wilson that has put Switzerland and Geneva at the center of the map just following World War I. And so it shows that even in the early 20th century, there were some special relationship between the United States and Switzerland. Having said that, what I'm just interested to share with you are a few elements. First, when we talk about cybersecurity, cybersecurity needs to be taken into perspective with a digital world. We have the question of the rise of cybercrime, security landscape dynamics, threat detection and response, how I see things going forward, and finally, since I have also the role of president of the Swiss Innovation Agency, I cannot forget to take the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about innovation in Switzerland. Now, first Kudelski Group, we are active for the last 30 years in protecting digital content, especially for the media, but we have extended into two areas that are extremely important going forward. First one is cybersecurity. The second one is securing the Internet of Things. And that is really some of the most important topics going forward in our civilization. Now, to understand why cybersecurity and securing the Internet of Things is important, we need first to understand what is at stake in the digital world. So I would first start by a statement done by Bill Gates in 1997 and the Comdex by saying that, look, if GM would work in the same way as Microsoft, we would have a car that will cost nothing and be extremely fuel efficient. Now, the official response of General Motors was pretty interesting by saying that if Microsoft would build such a car, it will crash twice a day. You will need to buy a new car if the line on the road have been repainted, asking you, are you sure, before deploying the airbag? And most interesting, suddenly you need to lift the door handle, turn the key and grab and hold the radio antenna to restart the system. And that is really interesting, to use the start button to turn off the engine, but I must say that the Germans have been able to adopt that earlier than the other one, even on the BMW and other nice cars. Having said that, if we look at today's world, you just look at the Tesla Model 3 spec. First, top speed, 162 miles per hour, 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3.2 seconds, range 310 miles, so not too bad. You get 140 miles per gallon, so we are not at the 1,000, but not very, far from it. We have artificial intelligence-based autopilot using the DevOps development method. But, and that is interesting, and that has been directly taken from what GM has predicted, sometimes you need to do a hard reset. So basically, you have to press on the 4 buttons at the same time, holding on the brake and so on. So just to say that sometimes reality is even more fascinating than the fiction. Now, on the Tesla, you have what is visible and what is less visible. And fundamentally, if you take a Tesla car, it's a car. The network of Tesla is a transportation system. And fundamentally, each Tesla car has the capability to upload the information to what they call a mothership. In a way, they say, get experience in driving and to optimize the way you do self-driving. And so you use artificial intelligence in order to do self-driving. So just to say that we see here that a car is not anymore a car, it's a digital system that have an engine, that have some wheels, and that have some brakes. So it's a fundamental shift in the way things are done. And all that is possible because the technology behind all the computer science has completely evolved in an exponential way. And what you need to understand, it's not only the technology itself, but between the devices, the data, in terms of volume and quality, the concept of cloud, the concept of mobile, IoT. Each one has grown its own dimension, and if you combine these different dimensions together, then you get something that is extremely complex. Now, in the digital world, and here maybe in the US it's something that is a given, but at least on the European continent, some people still believe that digital is about computer with application like word processing and others. So fundamentally thinking that if you are able to use the word as an application, you are already digital. But that was the digital of the 20th century. So fundamentally, we have gone in a system like DevOps, where you have the possibility to measure in a quite real-time information, you adapt the way you should do things, and have a fundamental loop to improve the technology one time after the other. So an interesting element with that is that you have the possibility to create very personalized service for the mass. One of the big differences today, at least from experience, United States has been extremely good at doing things at large scale. So fundamentally to do things for the mass. Switzerland has been specialized as doing more niche things. So basically having very high quality for niche market. Now, with the technology like AI and overall digitalization, you may have a very personalized approach to the mass. And that is quite a revolutionization of the system, and that is something where, for example, Switzerland needs to take that into its own agenda. Now, if you have this digitalization that is allowing incredible new things, at the same time, there is an appetite to hack that. And so that is bringing me to the rise of the cybercrime. First element is that the revenue, because don't forget, cybercrime is not just for the beauty. There is money to be made. And so fundamentally, the revenue done by the cyber hackers is estimated at $1.5 trillion annually. The average number of security breach per organization in 2018 has peaked at 145, up 11% compared to previous year. And it's pretty important, the average cost of a cybercrime per organization in 2018 has grown to $13 million. And the industry that are the most exposed is first banking, utility, and software, and there is no miracle. Banking and financial system is because there is some money to be stolen. So fundamentally, the appetite of the cyber criminal is first to make money. We have also some other element, but we'll see that after. And if you look at the top threat trends, you have malware, it's pretty stable. You have web-based attacks that are growing. You have web application attacks that are stable. Phishing that is going up. And so you don't need a license to do such type of phishing. And denial of service that is also growing. And that are the official statistics worldwide. Basically, in Switzerland, we have come to a very similar pattern. So basically, that is showing once more that in the cyberspace, there is no borders. Now we'll look at who are behind the hacks. First, in terms of nation states, they do that for geopolitical reasons. So basically, you have some countries that are not so nice in the cyberspace. You have cyber criminals that do that just to make money. That's at least a clear intention that is well understood. Hacktivists, it's for ideology. Terrorist group is ideology, but for another purpose, that is violence. You have people that are looking for great, sensation, and they just do that for satisfaction. And you have insider threats, and that are basically people that are not very happy with their employers and others. So that is showing that behind cyber attacks, you may have a real diversity of motivation, but all this motivation are resulting in one thing, that it's creating a disruption. Now, what are the weapons that are used? You have first social engineering. And it's important to understand that the human factor is a very important factor in cyber attacks. You have email or web delivery, a way to have something that is delivering malware content, for example, that can have incredible consequence. You have also, and that is very common, configuration errors that are creating incredible weaknesses in your solution. You have user word and password compromise. That is a very typical element that can allow to hack a system. You have denial of service, and you have advanced exploitation, that is especially when you have or backdoors that are known or backdoors by accident. Now, we'll just give you a few examples of attacks that we have discovered as a company operating in Switzerland. First one, we are talking here about the international organization located in Switzerland, where we have discovered within 2 hours, so we have been asked by this organization to have a look at what was happening, and we have within 2 hours discovered that it was one intruder, that was a state actor that was present for more than 400 days within the system, and that was the second state actor that was really at the brink to be really active there. So just to show that these elements are very dangerous, because most of the people even not notice that there is a hack happening. And that is, for Switzerland that has numbers of international organizations, that's something that is extremely concrete and dangerous. You have another example is a antivirus evasion. So a company that is headquartered and has the main office in Switzerland, that was done by a criminal organization, and the goal was to steal username and password. So here, fundamentally, you have a malware that has been propagated in more than 200 systems, and that has passed undetected by the McAfee antivirus system. So that is showing that even if you are just using conventional way to protect yourself, you have some risk. So you cannot just have a classical response to cyber attacks. You need to be a little bit smarter. And now, another case that is extremely interesting, because that's a way to steal power, computation power. So fundamentally, what we are telling, it's a criminal organization that has hijacked a computer system in a company to use computation power to create cyber currency. So fundamentally do currency mining. So fundamentally, by stealing computation time, what you create is cyber money, and you sell the cyber money. So fundamentally, you have no elements that have been stolen, but you have some creation of wealth without the consent of the company. So pretty interesting to see how smart can the hackers be. Now, one element that is pretty important, and that is pretty frightening as an element. If you look, the average time to detect an intrusion has been average globally going from 99 days to 78 days in 2018. But at the same time, you see that in the US, that has been an important effort to reduce this time. In Europe, this time has gone up. You say, oh, people have done less. No, it's simply that the hackers have been working faster than the defense. And that is also showing that today, generally speaking, on the European continent, there is not enough people don't realize how serious is an issue. And if you think that about 6 months is needed to find that there is an intrusion, imagine all the secrets that can be stolen in an organization. And that is showing that the situation even gets seriously. So if you look at Asia, it's worse, at least it was worse in 2017, but they are trying to do some effort going forward. And here, there is no miracle. If you look at how people are perceiving cyber threat, in North America is a number one, element on the agenda of the CEO. If you compare Western Europe, is not in the top 3. So fundamentally saying that there is a lack of perception how serious is the question. Now, that is bringing me to how we address such type of risk. First element is the difference between cybersecurity versus security in the IoT. First element is that cybersecurity generally is about protecting classical IT system against hackers. And the first element is a hack can result in theft of data, tampering with data, and or data destruction. But in most of the case, the hack is limited to the virtual world rather than the real world, with some notable exception in finance. So basically, if you hack a banking system, you can steal some money. But one of the major challenges is that we need to protect systems that have not been designed to be secure. Fundamentally, first computers were not designed to be permanently connected. So basically, you have to secure things that were not designed at the beginning to be secure. And this means that cybersecurity is used to detect cyber attack and to protect IT systems in a perpetual race against hackers. And fundamentally, more you have to steal, more the hacker will be active. Now, the chance with IoT is that the secure IoT solution is about designing and implementing solutions to secure a system, including a cloud infrastructure and secure device. And we have the possibility here to be a little bit ahead of what is happening. But on the other side, a hack of an IoT system can not only result in data theft and so on, but most seriously, you can create a real problem in the real world. Take an example. If you hack a system of email, it's not so pleasant, but if you hack your car, you can go down the cliff. So the consequence of a hack may be extremely different, and this includes, for example, systems like the grid. Now, for that reason, IoT security requires a different approach that is secure by design. This means that the risk as such may be higher, but with IoT, we may have solutions that are better. Now, it's not because it's secure by design that we should not be monitoring to still see what is possible in terms of attack. And don't forget that what is at stake with the IoT is extremely important. Now, as a company, what we do to secure the cyberspace, we do first advisory services to give the advice and to see what needs to be improved. We are able to provide some technology in order to implement such security, but also have managed security services that are allowing to trace and detect intrusion and take corrective action. And finally, to have solutions that are tailored design in order to really protect the specificity of some companies. Now, I will just give you an example of what we have developed as a specific technology that is secure. Let's imagine the classical system where you manage both data that are standard data and sensitive data in an IT system that is in your premise. What we have developed is a system where you migrate all your secure data in a secure enclave that is like a safe that is much harder to break. And one of the beauty of this system is that you can have the left part that is enterprise IT ecosystem that can migrate to the cloud, and you may have any cloud for that, while the sensitive data are really encapsulated in a very secure environment. So that's just an example of some development and technologies that we have brought to the market. Now, if we come to the IoT domain. So today, security is a number one concern of the people doing IoT, and knowing that the number of IoT installed devices is growing by billions. Now, our approach to that is that we provide an IoT secure platform. We are able to manage the life cycle of devices, knowing that the device needs to enter in the system, has a life within the system, and needs to be decommissioned once it's not anymore used. So basically, to be able to control the life of such device is something that is making the overall approach much more secure. And finally, we have some labs and some certification capability to check how secure is an existing solution that come from the silicon up to the complete solution. Now, the area of innovation we are working on currently, first, we continue to work on the Advanced Cyber Fusion Center to be able to track down, to detect all type of new attacks. We have Advanced Cyber Fusion Center specifically to secure the cloud, and we have the Advanced Cyber Fusion Center to secure solution in the IoT domain. Having said that, in Switzerland, we are securing a number of the grids, actor in Switzerland in a way to prevent them to be shut down in the cyberspace by some hackers. We have naturally the secure IoT platform. We have a concept that is called secure blueprint, is a strategic approach to see how sensitive is an organization against cyber attacks. We have the secure managed enclave, as I have just shown that before. We are working in the blockchain space in order to be able to assess or to design specific solution in the secure blockchain. And finally, to bring together blockchain and the IoT, knowing that blockchain has some constraints that are quite intensive in terms of computation power, while IoT speed and consumption are extremely important to bring element at the interface of the two is one of the most interesting area in terms of innovation. Now a few words about INNOSUISSE, our Swiss innovation agency. First element to give us information. So Switzerland is not too bad in terms of global competitiveness. So behind US, it has not been always like that, but basically we recognize that US is really competitive. Having said that, in terms of innovation, we are number one, and that is something pretty important. And that is not by chance. Basically, Switzerland is geographically a small country, but a superpower in terms of university and research. So we have number of university in the top 100 league. And one of the reasons for that is that we have a quite diverse base of students and professors. So 25% average number of foreign students, 50% of foreign professors in university, 20% of foreign professors in technical university, 67% of foreign PhD student and scientific collaborator. All that to say that Switzerland has a very open economy and very open academia, and that is helping. Now, even for a geographically small country, quite an important budget in terms of research and development at the country level. In 2015, 27.5 billion Swiss francs, so about the same in US dollars, with about 70% coming from the private sector and 22% coming from the public sector, and INNOSUISSE is one of the actors here. And if I'm looking going forward, INNOSUISSE as the Swiss Innovation Agency, and we are working in the program 2021 to 2024 in terms of priority for education, research, and innovation. Digitalization is an important element, big data, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and cybersecurity. So just to say that to stay in a top league, you need to invest going forward, and to invest in education, research, and innovation are very important elements to make it happen. And last point, Switzerland, even as a geographically small country, is present in many places, including in the US. Here it's a picture from a CES show with a Swiss Tech pavilion. So you see, and that is a very iconic element, Stöckli ski, pretty well known in Switzerland, but you see that in terms of diversity, we have also people that look a little bit more like an Apache than a typical Swiss. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to have a panel discussion.
While we're switching over the PowerPoints, hi, I'm Meg King with the Wilson Center of Science and Technology Innovation Program. And we are thrilled to have our second keynote from Wilson Center Global Fellow Evan Wolf. Evan's a partner at Crowell & Mooring's law firm here around the corner in Washington, where he leads the cybersecurity practice. He has an extensive background, has been a computer expert in the past, a geologist, is a big thinker, and has a really exciting presentation for you today on the future of cybersecurity. So with that, Evan. And then we will join, he will join the panel next.
Great, thank you very much. And as Meg said, my day job is being a lawyer, so lawyers always have to start off with a disclaimer. So nothing I'm going to be saying today should be construed as legal advice. If it does, meet me outside, and I'll collect some money, and we can sign an agreement. But what I am going to be talking about is a joint project that's called Collective Defense, and it really fits very nicely from the great review we just heard and the overview of where technology is going, how people protect networks. But this sort of comes out of a set of activities. Me and a couple other friends were at a hacker conference many months ago. And like all great ideas, it happened about 2 a.m. over at a bar while we were eating some really good Thai food in Austin, Texas. And I'd been involved in about 800 data breaches over the last 11 years. And for the decade before that, I was a data scientist. So I understood what it was like to protect and defend and attack networks then too. And we fundamentally agreed that the problem with cybersecurity today is we have two sides of the team, and the analogy I'll use for the Swiss soccer players in the room is it's like trying to play soccer. We have all the offensive players on one side and all the defensive players on the other. And in American football, we call them special teams that would be working in the middle, but we have no special teams when it comes to cyber. And so that's the concept behind where collective defense and the definition of collective defense started. Since then, it's a project that's been supported by both the Wilson Center and the World Economic Forum. And if I could get the next slide. Actually, would you mind switching to the very last slide for a second? Yep, that one. Oh, no, not that far. Sorry, these are new slides and a little out of order. One last. And this is sort of a very bad graphic, but is a good place to start with, like all good ideas starts with bad graphics, is that when we think about who's responsible for defending networks right now, it's almost entirely, as we just heard, private sector. It's companies. Every now and then, if it's infrastructure that the government owns, they're responsible for defending it themselves. But almost in the 800 breaches I've worked on in the 11 years, even in some of the biggest cases, we never have industry and government defending a network at the same time. There's 3 examples of where that's not true. The first is when we have requests from the government in the US. This comes from compulsory services like subpoenas. And when we get subpoena service, that allows industry and government to work together. Sometimes we have information sharing. I often describe information sharing as a faith-based initiative, although it's something that's become very popular in America. It doesn't protect your network. It's a good step towards protecting networks, but it's a way for industry and government to understand what are the threats and how we can work together on those collective threats. And then finally, sorry to use some American shorthand, but we have voluntary operations where industry, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI can agree, we want to protect these things together. But with the exception of those sort of 3 narrow examples, almost all the time it's industry on one side defending and the various governments around the world responsible for offense of networks. As we all know, whether it's in the US or other countries, they have to both have an offense and a defensive capability. And there's some examples of where people can move across the security industry and the federal IT. So that if that's the state of art where we are right now, what I want to spend a few minutes talking about is how do we get to a collective defense? Because right now that doesn't really help anyone. If we could have the ability to collectively defend and respond to network attacks, we could actually solve and make this whole problem work a lot better. And what we've come up with are there sort of 4 pillars of collective defense. The first one is legal and regulatory, and I'm sorry, but this is going to be a little bit U.S. based for a few minutes, but I guess I'm giving the U.S. side. And then second is governance. I was fortunate enough to spend the first 5 years at the Department of Homeland Security, and one of the first things we learned when we were starting the department was we have to create a chain of command, and we have to understand who are our customers, who are the constituents of the department, and what does the homeland mean? And in some ways, cybersecurity is sort of at that moment right now. Third is technology. We're going to identify some of the technologies that are allowing us to do collective defense. And unfortunately, a lot of the technology that is preventing that from happening right now. And last, operations, because if we're actually going to be able to defend and respond to networks across government and industry, we need to have a common template. So quickly, some of the barriers that we're currently working with right now in legal and regulatory. First and foremost are the liability and litigation issues. In every incident I've always worked on, There's one question that comes up, and it usually comes up either between the CEO or the general counsel or board member, and it comes up pretty quickly, which is, do we have to tell anyone about this incident? Because not all incidents do we read about in the New York Times. In fact, I get paid a lot of money to make sure incidents don't get written in the New York Times on a regular basis. And so for that reason, there's a lot of analysis we do to identify why do we have to tell people. There are regulatory drivers, as we've seen with Europe and the GDPR, and in the US, we have a lot of other regulations if you have different contracts with federal agencies or you have certain types of data. But that also prevents you from working with governments at times, because those same liabilities, those same regulations disallow in contracts that you have with customers don't always allow you to work fluidly across government agencies. There are also antitrust and anti-competitiveness reasons why industry and government can't work collectively. And finally, there are conflicting interests, because if the government and industry are not going to be working on the same page or have the same sort of defined benefit or defined value, then we can't work together. And so luckily, these are not all insurmountable problems. We've actually faced this before as a country. When we were entering World War II, one of the fundamental problems the US government had is we didn't have enough airplanes. And so in order to build, it was taking about 6 weeks to build a bomber at the time. In order to turn that from a 6-week process to about a day or day and a half process, we entered into what were called voluntary agreements under a very old law called the National Defense Act. And what the National Defense Act, or the Defense Production Act as it was later called, allows industry and government to do is enter into these voluntary agreements to say we have a common good or a common interest, and we're going to work together, whether it's across verticals or horizontals within industry, to protect and defend. And we can enter into those voluntary agreements, as we've heard before. There's a lot of, within Switzerland and other countries, common interests that we can enter into. But we have to, first of all, have a legal and regulatory framework to do that, which we currently don't have. And there's a great lesson to be learned here from the financial crisis. I always think, as my old boss when I was in government always said, never let a crisis go to waste. And I think we learned a lot from the financial crisis in the U.S. And one of the great things we got out of the legislation, the TARP, the program, the legal program that helped us with the reforms, was the concept of conducting a stress test of liquidity for financial institutions. And the last thing you want a cyber lawyer talking to you about is liquidity of financial institutions in front of a bunch of Swiss diplomats and executives. But the importance of what we get out of the stress test is we define what is the worst possible day for an institution, and then we ask them to test themselves on it, test them in every way possible. Companies voluntarily do this on a regular basis. I know we have some CISOs in the room who probably regularly say, I do a penetration test, which is an example of that. But we don't have a way of sharing those results of working across entities in that area. And that's what we get out of the financial stress test out of TARP. So if that's the first pillar, the second is governance. And it was, I guess, 8 years ago, I had to interview a series of CISOs within government. And then I had to interview on behalf of an academic and project I was working on, a series of CISOs within Fortune 20 companies. And what I realized after interviewing about 15 of them, they were all really fantastic individuals who didn't know who each other were and were entirely had different backgrounds for their jobs. In fact, very few of them were actually trained in the job of being a chief information security officer. And so we fundamentally have a governance problem when it comes to CISOs. And once again, no disrespect meant to the very well-intentioned and good CISOs in the room. But there isn't a single reporting structure. Some go to boards, some don't, some report internally, some actually report to CIOs, which is inherently, I think, a conflict of interest. And more importantly, there is not a single counterpart within the US government for CISOs. Even if you're in the most regulated sectors like banks and the defense sector, and you ask them if there's an incident, who do you report to? There really isn't a single point of entry for that definition. And then also, there are no collective standards. And here I'm going to turn to what I think is singularly the most boring U.S. regulatory environment ever, which is the Sarbanes-Oxley controls. And Sarbanes-Oxley was once again under the category of let's not let a bad crisis go to waste. And so Sarbanes-Oxley really reformed how financial controls within the accountability in publicly traded companies occur in the U.S. And it did one thing more than anything else. It took the role of the chief financial officer, which very similarly look to how CISOs look today before Sarbanes-Oxley. Some of them had very important, prominent jobs. Some reported to boards, some didn't. Some actually were, thanks to the creation of Sarbanes-Oxley, not doing their job at all. And it said, we're going to create a system of accountability, and we're going to make CFOs actually have a job where they, thanks to the SEC and oversight, actually have a real job that's regulated and responsible within companies. And then we're also going to create a counterpart within government. And that simple process of creating accountabilities in the US for the CISO function would allow us to move along and start create that governance that would then allow us to sort of better understand how companies and functions in this area can work together. Third is technology. And as I said, right now, I think the best technology, and I have many friends that spend their days either innovating or developing the hottest end of technology today, which is endpoint detection. And that's the concept of we are going to protect a single computer or a server. We're going to make sure that if it gets broken into, we know exactly who broke into it, what files they stole. And as those files are leaving the computer network or the system, we will make sure we capture all that to make the investigation better. But what that doesn't do is allow, as that computer network gets broken into and as the alerts go off and as the alarms go on, it doesn't allow us to actually do anything collectively with that information. All a CISO can do, unless they want to go, or a company can do, unless they want to violate laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, is report that data has been stolen from their network, report that it's gone to another computer or another computer system or maybe another nation state or maybe a criminal organization. But there's not a real-time way and a platform to be able to coordinate those responses within a government or within multiple governments. And as we've seen as the US government works more collaboratively with our peers and what are called the Five Eyes nations, we really do need within industry and government common technology that allows us to work together and a platform that does that. And once we have that common technology, we can get to the last piece that having spent a lot of my early on career in the area of operations, that is most important. Because once we have the legal and regulatory barriers removed, and once we have a common governance model and a common technology model, then we can actually start doing joint operations. So as a company, as we saw, gets attacked, whether it's a variety of incidents, they can quickly identify who is attacking them, whether it's through their own, what they know on themselves, or through working with government, and then the government can take over. And in some cases in the US, that could be anything from local law enforcement to federal law enforcement to the intelligence community or the Department of Defense. Who takes over in some cases is less important to the industry rather than we actually have a response system in place. When we think about how the sort of physical world works, and I'm one of having been a law professor now for 20 semesters or last 10 years, I try not to make analogies between cyber and physical because I think that's sort of how we got into this problem to begin with. But in law enforcement, it's a very interesting idea because when your house gets broken into, the first thing you don't start doing is trying to think about, do I call the FBI? Do I call the SEC? You usually start with either law enforcement, or if you're a large company, you start with your federal enforcement, and then you let them come and take over. You don't conduct your own investigation into, who broke into your network. And as I work with a lot of domestic critical infrastructure companies, and the last point that I've often seen is majority of the attacks that are happening against utility and pipeline and manufacturing companies are happening, as we've heard, from foreign nation states. These same companies have a lot of physical infrastructure that would be devastated by a single missile attack. Yet they don't have any missile defense or anti-Scud missile systems. Yet we expect them to be able to managing on their own their defense and response mechanisms. So that's the framework that we've spelled out. And what we're moving towards is an offense and defense where we can work collectively in a much more fluid movement. And I think some of those elements are what we're going to be talking about later on today. As long as I haven't insulted our panelists and our co-CISOs too much. Thank you.
Well, Thank you very much for our two keynotes, and I'd like to introduce our third panelist as well. Paige Adams is the Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, which you just heard about, at Zurich Insurance, North America. Oh, no, Zurich Insurance.
I don't know if I want to be now.
Well, I think you are an information warfare officer with a very long decorated career in the Navy. I think you'll be okay. Paige was, as I mentioned, an information warfare officer and was also part of the Navy Cyber Defense Operations Command. And he can tell you more about that. So I'd like to start with a quick question. The business model, at least from a governance perspective, doesn't seem to be working. So can each of you give me just a brief assessment of what companies can do, what states can do from your position, and what we can do from an alliance perspective and globally to address this challenge? There are obviously some technological tools, but this is very much a people problem. So from your perspective, how can we change the paradigm from where we are today as a very responsive and not offensively active organization to one that is much more nimble and working together? Mr. Kidalski, you want to take a stab at that?
First element, I would say, I would use an analogy. Fundamentally, if you have to defend yourself as a company or as a country, you need to be able to play in the same geographic zone than your attacker. Mm. And the first element I would say is that the attacker is by definition in the cyberspace not regulated. Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, as a private organization, you can first use the best technology to defend yourself. You can do everything that once you are attacked to minimize the probabilities that the attack is successful and to avoid to have too much damages. But as a private organization, you are not above the law and you are not the law. And so fundamentally, you can stop where your legal, limits are. And here it's a real limitation, knowing that first, cybercrime has no border. Every country is your neighbor. And so fundamentally, if you are not able to play in the same field, you are playing with
one hand tied behind your back. Exactly. Yes, exactly. How do we change those pesky laws, Evan? Or what is the big idea for doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would love to see, as many of my colleagues have said, we'll have some cyber 9/11 or some big cyber Pearl Harbor, and then we'll instantly wake up the next day and have a perfect legal framework. I don't know if it's going to work that way. Right now, I think we're seeing a top-down and a bottom-up approach. We are seeing a lot of additional authorities given to the federal government via what's happening at the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the intelligence community. But at the same time, we're seeing government industry becoming more and more accountable, whether it's via the current regulatory framework that's happening at the federal level, or what's happening in states. I think when you look at what California and New York and other states are doing that are really innovative regulations that are trying to sort of boil the water a little bit at a time. Not that companies are lobsters, but we are seeing that increasing slow process. I don't know if that's going to get us to sort of where we need to be. So I do think we're going to have to think about, and this is partially what I would hope that as a country and as a globe we would start doing now before we have a major incident. Because when I look at my first 5 years at the Department of Homeland Security, and I've now spent a while teaching about the Homeland Security Act, the single biggest problem we have with that whole response to Homeland Security isn't the people or the approach that we took. It's the fact that we wrote a law in 9 months. And that just isn't sufficient time to think about all the internalizations and externalities of Homeland Security. And this is even a much more complicated problem than that. And so I think we need to spend more time on it, have more discourses like this, at sort of at local and global levels. And then within companies, there are some very simple things I think they can do, and hopefully I think we'll get into those a little later, but part of it has to do with having someone in charge, and thankfully we have a competent and someone who can talk to us about being in charge of securing networks, and then also understanding what's in your network.
Yeah, well, first, I would say I agree with a lot of what Andre and Evan have already said, particularly some of the technical things that we have to do, as well as the governance pieces. And I've spent, the first half of my career more maybe thinking about how do we defend. And as you mentioned, my time in the Navy, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we defend Navy networks from nation states, as well as just configuration challenges and all the routine things that we deal with. And now I do the same thing at Zurich, and I think about how do we protect our customers, how do we protect our employees. And I think, though, that I came to a realization, and a lot of us in the industry have come to a realization in the past few years, that you need to think beyond defense, because it's not just about how do you prevent attacks from occurring. As an insurance company, of being in insurance, we know well that there's no such thing as zero risk. So there's no such thing as zero or 100% prevention. There's always going to be some risk element. So we really need to think about the end-to-end, the response, the resilience piece. So we're talking more and more, and that's become a little bit of a buzzword here lately, but we really do believe that resilience is the way to go. Now, how do you achieve resilience?
Well, like in a ransomware example, I mean, if there's a hospital, for example, that has been attacked by ransomware, if they have backed up data, then it doesn't matter. So that's an example.
It does.
Yeah.
But I think one thing to start off with, and it goes to a point that Evan just made earlier, and I know you don't like analogies, but as a CISO, all I do is talk in analogies to
You
people
have
that
to.
aren't necessarily technical. But it's for example, when a bank gets robbed, if you have a teller at gunpoint and they're taking all the cash, the teller doesn't think twice about pushing that button, that hidden button, to call the police, to call law enforcement. It's an entirely different situation. And with most businesses, if they have a cyber breach, we call Evan or one of his friends to figure out how do we not tell anybody about it, right? That's the kind of the prevailing mentality. And it's because of this kind of victimization of the victim or persecution of the victim. So one of the things that we need to do, and what we would like to see out of a public-private partnership, is come up with some regulation and some protection mechanisms to protect the victim, so companies and others will be more willing to come forward. Because as an insurer, we have a stake in this, because in terms of risk management, we can't manage risk if we don't understand it, and we can't understand it if we don't have access to the underlying data. Mm-hmm. And we can't get that underlying data if people aren't willing to share it. So it starts with being more open and creating protection mechanisms so folks are more willing to be forthcoming.
And also, I'll get just 1 second. And also, as an insurer, you're in a unique position in that you can take up where government has failed so far. You may actually be able to move the market, I think, and that to insure someone or a company against cyber risk, they have to meet a certain level of standards. Can you tell us how you all are thinking about it from that angle? And so, in the absence of government change, which we hope will come, how are you thinking about this?
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting underwriting problem just from that aspect of how do we measure risk. But, we've got some great statisticians and threat modelers and actuaries that deal in uncertainty all the time. And the great thing about uncertainty is once you realize that you have uncertainty, you can model that too. But a lot of it is just a lot of underwriting, frankly, and how we think about cyber risk just comes down to kind of the common sense things. It's, basic hygiene. Do you have these things in place? Do you have a CISO? Do you have someone that
Do you
takes
know what's on your
accountability?
network?
Right. I
It's
mean,
surprising.
and some of these things sound very mundane,
Yeah.
but they are things, we've demonstrably can show that when there is a cyber breach, if these factors were present or if they weren't present, they do very much play into the cost of that breach. If you have a CISO, it's been shown that the cost per record of a data breach is decreased by about $4 a record on average in the U.S. But those things add up. So it's doing a lot of the basics, getting the basics right, and adhering to principles. That's step one.
Yeah. Mr. Kelsey.
Now, I was just, I think, to add 2 points. First element, there is a clear asymmetry between the one that is attacking and the one that has to defend. The one that is attacking needs to just be successful once. The one that is defending needs to be successful every day. And that is an asymmetry that is not so easy to handle. Second element I was just interested to make is that in one sector, collaboration between private and public has been pretty good, is in defending content, Hollywood content in television. And here we have experimented over the last 20 to 25 years an outstanding collaboration with entity like FBI, where all the elements that as a private sector were not allowed to do, were able to do jointly. For example, joint red to find what was happening in hacker location. So there are some possibility, and when you can have such a collaboration, you have really the capability to address the issue. If you don't have this collaboration, it's much, much harder.
Yeah.
So about 3 years ago, I was asked to give a series of talks to CEOs of mid-cap companies. I think do 12 of them in the course of 6 months. And after the first few of them, I realized, first of all, I'm talking to CEOs, so I need to keep things very simple, and I can't do lists of 10. I need to actually keep things to lists of 3. So I decided to end my talk with 3 points that every CEO should do if he wants to understand cybersecurity. And I said, first of all, when you get back to your office, go find out who's responsible for protecting your network. Maybe a CISO, it might not be called a CISO, but find out if there is. If there's no one in charge, then you're in trouble, and you probably need to invest in this. And if there is, ask to meet with them. If you meet the guy and he has, once again, no disrespect page, but if he has is wearing a black shirt and lots of tats, don't be scared. He's probably okay. If he's wearing a tie and you're a globally traded insurance company, you're probably fine too. But anyway, don't be scared by their appearance. But then ask him, does he have a plan? And if he says, of course not, I know what I'm doing, I don't have any sort of incident response plan, then you probably need to think about firing the guy. And if he does have a plan, ask him if you can read it and suggest read it. And then the last thing you need to do is ask him if you've had any incidents, and ask him to tell you about the last incident. And if he says, we've never had any incidents, we've never been attacked, or I can't tell you about the last one because I don't remember when it was, you probably need to think about firing him, getting a new plan, and starting over again. Because that's the bottom line, is this needs to be a part of the vocabulary of CEOs, of boards, of companies. That's how I think you create resiliency, because it is this sort of interwoven model of having the appropriate resources to protect networks, having the sort of ability of management to speak to the employees, because ultimately cyber is not a silicon. It's not a problem that's based on computers. It's based on humans, as we've heard today. And I always think of this as a carbon problem, not a silicon problem. And so therefore we need management and those that actually manage the employees to help with this. And then finally, there is an area of risk that we need to evolve in this area. I've been doing a lot of work for some global companies around quantitative risk and different models. There's a model out there called the FAIR model, and that's a very exciting area, but we need to spend more time, money as an industry, as a collective, as a globe, thinking about how we can manage risk in actual real quantitative ways, like we can do in economics, in other areas of risk, and other areas of security. And I think that's a very exciting area. If there are any young students in the room that want to go into quantitative cyber risk modeling, I highly encourage it.
Another question, Paige, for you, because you mentioned risk, and it's a big theme here, and you are an insurance company. Why is this still, and as Mr. Kadolsky gave us at the beginning some stunning facts about how much money is lost, why is this, what is the threshold? Why is this still such a problem that people want to hide and not share data? I mean, what will change this? And it doesn't have to be a catastrophic incident, but from your perspective.
Well, I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the sort of the victim mindset. I mean, companies are willing to throw a lot of money at the problem to make it go away sometimes. I mean, that just is what it is. Folks are concerned too about things like reputational risk, rightly so. The regulatory impacts are pretty great, and I think if you consider what the implications are of, say, GDPR, for instance, which the penalties for noncompliance or penalty for breach is 4% of the revenue of a company, which can be a large figure. So some of the cost of the actual breach itself, I mean, and we've seen and I think this is a little bit troubling too, but particularly in cases like ransomware, we've seen an increased propensity now to pay ransoms, right? This has become a hot market, and I think
It works. The business
it
is
works,
good.
and it wouldn't continue unless it worked. And I think that this is an opportunity where government can get more involved. The public sector can come and help, enforce and put in stricter penalties against, ransomware and these types of events. Is it going to be 100% effective either? No, but certainly if the cost of carrying out these types of criminal events was raised for the criminal, I think it would make a difference.
So you are, Mr. Kudelski, part of Bilderberg and WEF. How can, from a multi-nation and an alliance perspective, what can be done, in your view, to make this kind of an effort more possible?
So first element is awareness, and I must say that within the World Economic Forum there have been a number of initiatives to put that pretty high on the agenda. So that is the first element. Now, the real effort is both on the private and public sector to accept to be working closely together. And here, a country like Switzerland has one advantage, is to have a system where the military is done by people from milice. And we can really use such type of elements to create better communication between the two parts of the society. But for me, the real element is to allow both at the company level and at the public and the state level to have much more discussion. Because at the end, if you are able to discuss a real issue, you can solve them much better. If you are just looking on one part of the problem, you will not be able to really solve it. You will be just defending that. And places like the World Economic Forum are institution that really considers that as an absolute top priority. And there is a new center that is established now for this exact purpose.
Evan, so politics always gets in the way. What are the prospects for moving forward some sort of a proposal, perhaps not in legislation, but with kind of an oversight, collective partnership between, let's say, Congress and the Department of Homeland Security and others? What is there something we can do now in the interim to get to this next step?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting there. I think we do have a bottom-up approach. Luckily, security is often a bipartisan issue, and for that reason, we're seeing, if you look at the sort of actions in the most recent legislation, like the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDA, which did a lot of things in terms of adding capability to DoD in terms of cyber defense and how they protect infrastructure. It also took some very strong positions like preventing all financial use funding to Huawei as a part of NDA, which was then followed up by the executive order. So we are seeing actions being taken, in even this time of great sort of partisan rivalry where the right decision is being made. From my alma mater, the Department of Homeland Security, we also have seen some sort of, I would say, great steps forward with the establishment of the cybersecurity critical cyber infrastructure security agency, so new that I still haven't been able to memorize the name on a regular basis. CISA, which is an actual
security in there twice. It's complicated.
Yeah, which is the 8th operational element of the department, and it really is focused just on this problem. And they are continuing to get the appropriate resources. Director Krebs, the person who runs it, is really focused on creating a regional model within the U.S. so we can understand that this isn't something that's going to be solved in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters of the department, but it's going to be solved in the regions like other problems, whether it's the FBI or Coast Guard or other elements of DHS are really solved out in the field. And that's, I think, another great approach that the government has been really focused on and taking. So, this is having a Swiss-German father and a Polish mother, but having grown up in Washington, D.C., I've always said I'm a child of the politics of D.C. So this is definitely a very interesting time. But But what we're seeing is we're still making progress in this space, and I think 2020 will, with the good news about the next election cycle, is this will be an issue for every candidate, and I think that's great considering it was only 2 elections ago that no candidate even mentioned cybersecurity.
Yeah. So something fairly unique to at least Europe, not this country, is this concept of apprenticeships and the next generation. I believe both Zurich and I know, Mr. Kowalski, you all have apprenticeships. Can you tell us a little bit about your programs, why they matter, and is that a way to change the mindset going forward?
So I would just start by one point. How do you really create great pirates, great hackers? Fundamentally, the profile of a hacker is someone that is maybe not very academic, start very early to try to do things that are sometimes borderline, sometimes even worse than borderline. But the issue is such type of profile is not very academic. And I personally believe that we have an opportunity to identify such type of talents and to offer them an alternative route to get specialized and to come in the right side rather than the dark side. Mm-hmm. And so fundamentally, we have established in the US a concept that is based on what we have done for decades in Switzerland, that is to allow someone to have an apprentice program and to get at the end of its training with a real job. And so we have worked with high school and some community college in the US in order to
that's right, you are doing it in the US.
To do that and to bring some special knowledge to people that were not at the beginning ready to do college education. With one other advantage is that you don't have debt. Fundamentally, the students can earn money from day one. And it's not as a replacement to the college education. That's just one other alternative that gives opportunity to take people that are talented in the cyberspace in order to be educated and to have a job that is really something useful. And last point, but not least, we're looking for this program to have exchange between people in the US and in Switzerland to give them even a more international element. And with that, we may have people that were not dedicated from day one to have such a career, to be specialized in that, and to have more specialists in this field. Because one of the elements that maybe has not been said enough, that if you fire the ones that are not good, you need to find some that are better. And to find some that are better, you need to educate them. And so fundamentally, there is a lack of resources that really understand what is cybersecurity, and we need to educate and train more of them.
Paige.
And I, excuse me, I agree with that 100%. And we've had similar experience and similar motivations for pursuing the apprentices. I tell you, if you look at some of the statistics, and by the way, you mentioned the World Economic Forum earlier, and specifically the Global Center for Cybersecurity, of which Zurich is a founding member as well. So I sit on some of the panels that the GCC is undertaking now, and when we launched the GCC and said about, well, what are the big challenges in cybersecurity that we need to really think about? Cyber skills gap rose to the top of the stack, because if you look at some of the estimates that are out there, by 2021 we'll have a 3 million job deficit in cybersecurity jobs. And that's a big number, no matter how you look at it. So the question is really, okay, well, where are we going to get these skills from, right? Because do we wait around for a college graduate to come to us with a 4-year degree in computer science or a master's degree in computer science? Obviously, we love to have those folks, and we have a place for them. But I think that cyber is one of the areas that's probably one of the best examples of what I've heard referred to as now the the new-collar worker. And a new-collar worker is somebody that comes from a non-traditional path that has a very specific set of skills that you can apply in a certain area. And there's a lot of cyber jobs out there where we can take people from non-traditional routes and put them to work immediately. And it goes to something that Andre said earlier. One of the things, and we talked earlier about this, it's really all about aptitude. more so than the skills and the training. We can bring the skills and the training and provide experience, and that's what the apprenticeship program does for us. We launched our Cyber Apprentice program in Schaumburg, right outside of Chicago, where I'm headquartered. We launched it in the U.S. Last year with 4 apprentices, and it's been a smashing success, so much so that we're going to probably double or triple the size of the program this year. But these are folks that, the challenge is not so much finding people, right? People are out there. They want to. There's a lot of demand. A lot of people want to be cyber professionals. The challenge is the barrier to entry. Because if I have someone that says, I'm really interested in this, I understand computers, I grew up with computers, I learned how to code on my own, but a 4-year degree is not accessible or not attainable to me for whatever reason, we think that person, may be useful, and they may have some aptitude and some skills that we can further hone. So we want to tap into that, and there's a lot of those folks out there, and we've been able to do that through the apprenticeship program. So essentially what we do is it's a work-study program, 2 years of school, combined with on-the-job experience. So it's about a 60-40 split. They do 60% on-the-job training, 40% in an academic environment, and we put them through a rotation of different disciplines in cyber, such as incident response, forensics, vulnerability management. And so far, we're getting ready to graduate our first cohort, and all 4 apprentices have come in. They've done exceedingly well, exceeded all expectations, and they're just about ready to graduate from the program. So I think that there's plenty of opportunity for expanding this. And it's very much based on the Swiss model. That's what we use, the Swiss model for apprentices. It's been so successful in the U.S., and we're now expanding that to Dublin. So we're starting an apprentice program in Dublin, which is another tech hub that we have that should be launching next year.
Fantastic. Great. Well, let's open it up to audience. One more comment and then audience.
Maybe just one element, I think, as an add-on. Fundamentally, to really protect ourselves against hackers, we need to have also people thinking like hackers and not like designers. And fundamentally,
It's a very good point.
the usual thing to define a computer system is defined by what it should do. A hacker is trying to understand how it should not work in the ways that is different from what was expected. So fundamentally, the way of thinking is fundamentally different, and the classical college education is not automatically training to think outside of the box.
Agree. Yes. First question.
Do I need a microphone?
Yes, it's right here.
Peter Summer with Capital Intelligence Group. We're the first world global news service using blockchain as a delivery platform. My question is on what I hear from CEOs all over the world, from Asia, US, France, Korea, is the lack of a unified standard for cybersecurity. While when we're seeing this new nationalism, we want to be first on blockchain cybersecurity in the U.S. We see the war with Huawei in China. We see France doesn't like U.S. and U.S. doesn't like France. And Switzerland is the only place where, one, the importance of cybersecurity because you have UBS and Credit Suisse and Zurich and all those. 2, you are completely neutral. It's not in your interest to play one side or other. Do you think Switzerland can create a global, highly secure cybersecurity standard? Because the biggest risk, talking to people at the Federal Reserve, Treasury, is attack on our global financial system. Forget a hospital. If you take down Morgan Stanley or Deutsche Bank's derivative system, the world will end. And these systems are not as secure as we thought. Is that something that you're doing in Switzerland as your company, sir?
It's not a question first of company, it's more a question of country. And I remember some discussion with our federal councillor Schneider-Hamann saying that trust is one of the highest assets that Switzerland has. And fundamentally, in the cyberspace, there is a need for trust. And I think the initiative of the World Economic Forum is a very good starting point. There are some discussion also to have some cyber Geneva Convention. So there are some idea to go in this route, but to be really efficient here, you need on one side this neutral approach, but you need also to increase the level of expertise. And that, and I'm not speaking my company side, but my federal agency side, it's something that we are working on to basically raise one more, step, so level of knowledge in this field.
I think, too, I would add to that is I think Switzerland is certainly in a good place to be an example. I think that the challenge there, first off, as it pertains to standards, the problem with standards is that everybody has one and they're all different, right? But I think that it's hard for any one country either to really go it alone. And I think that that's where organizations such as the World Economic Forum, and that's sort of the aspiration of the GCC as well, to come in and provide sort of a catalyst or sort of a safe space, safe ground for a lot of different governments to come in and pair with the private sector and establish some sort of common ground. So I think that probably if we see a convergence on standards, it might be through an organization such as that necessarily than any one particular country, but it takes a lot of countries working in concert with each other.
Other questions? Otherwise.
Evelyn Rulin, freelance marketer and friend of the Europa Institute. We are all talking about cybersecurity here. In essence, it's a breach of privacy. And privacy is a basic human right. And what is being done as far as, are you following the guidelines of the GPDR, the EU's GPDR? How is it used in the U.S., for instance, in Chicago at your headquarters, sir?
I mean, I'll answer that from a Zurich perspective because we're unique in some ways because we're a Swiss company, but we have a global footprint. We have businesses in every region of the world, in 44 different countries. And our belief and one of our core principles is that we take privacy very seriously, and we have sort of a mandate and a code of ethics around how we consider customer and employee privacy. And we tried to do that, I mean, even in advance of the GDPR. But we think in terms that privacy, first we take it very seriously, but also I often see security and privacy being talked about as two discrete things. And as a security professional, I believe that security and privacy go hand in hand. You can't have an expectation of privacy unless you have security in place as well. So for me, even though my formal mandate as the CISO is really more on the security side, and we have an information governance officer that deals more on the privacy side, we collaborate very much. GDPR, when GDPR came along, we even in advance of it taking effect, we stood up a program. We wanted to really understand what it meant, what were the implications, and were we aligned to the standards and the principles of the GDPR. So we, personally, at Zurich, we expended a lot of effort into that. And in fact, we've somewhat established some thought leadership, I think, around privacy as it relates to the GDPR and others. And so we're in a position now where we've actually been providing some advisory services to some of our customers around privacy, how they can become more compliant with GDPR. And we like to think of ourselves as GDPR compliant globally, not just for our business units that are in Europe, in the EU. Our North America standards are the same as what we have in the EU. We abide by the same principles. And we're starting to see this, the concepts behind GDPR that are taking off in other regions as well. I think many of you may have heard about the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which kind of, it's different from the GDPR, but it sort of follows in the same vein. And I think that that's not going to be the last of it. This concept of privacy is so fundamental, and there's so many threats to privacy now. If you look at what's in the news with tech companies, Facebook, Google, others, and sort of some of the implicit threats there, people are starting to really take privacy more seriously now. So I think it's an issue that's not going to go away, and it has to be married tightly with security.
Yep.
Yeah. Would just add that with the time, people realize how privacy is important. And I think GDPR is a first step, But going forward with an increasing digitalization of the society, the privacy will be a very important element. And I think that we need going forward to have an evolution of some of the legislation, but at the same time to not prevent to do some fundamental progress. I give you an example. If you take some cancer treatments, to be really efficient, you need some data. And so fundamentally, you need at the same time to preserve information like privacy, but to be able to collectively use information in order to make progress in the medicine. And that is really one of the biggest challenges that we'll have going forward. And we need to have, in terms of legislation, some things that is really making sense and not something that is just looking fine when you look at it, but will prevent to do elements that are absolutely key for the future of the society.
Evan, you all spend a lot of time in your firm on GDPR. Any thoughts or pass?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I'll echo what Paige said. The name of our group is the Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice Group. As someone who came at this field via cyber, I completely see that there's an interaction and whether sometimes we call it holistic or an integration between privacy and cyber, and you can't really have one with another, and this is the trend we're seeing. I think, we do have a little bit of GDPR fatigue that's happening to many of the companies. I don't think that's an official syndrome, but if you're having some trouble with it, please give me a call. And that companies spend a lot of time just focusing on the basics of are we able to track our user data in a way that's complying with GDPR? The right to be forgotten, a very difficult technical concept. Can we do that? And now that we reached that date and we're waiting and we've gotten, the first fine and there's some other fines that are coming in and we're waiting to see what enforcement looks like, companies are kind of taking a break. But I also see within many companies, what they're really doing is focusing on all the things that they couldn't do over the last few years when they were sort of on the GDPR sprint, which is focusing on, making sure they have good governance, they have the right policies and procedures. I'm still on a regular basis surprised by how many companies don't have a good playbook, which is sort of the core document that both your insurance company and your board want you to see that you have in place. And so but I'm seeing even really robust global companies go back to their playbooks and say, do we have this really? Do we have a GDPR case study or use case sort of spelled out in here? And are we ready for a big privacy incident? So that's sort of where we're seeing. But I think the GDPR and CCPA and these great regulations that give us the ability to use lots of acronyms will keep on going.
Yeah, and just one thing to what Evan said too, and I think this is what a lot of people don't understand or somewhat minimize, that compliance with GDPR and CCPA and some of these other things is not just a willingness, a want to comply. There's very specific technical challenges. So Evan mentioned the right to be forgotten. If you think about what that really means, that means you expunge all of this data from your system. If a customer says, well, I no longer want you to have that, they have the right to be forgotten. You remove that. But that presents a very real technical challenge for a lot of companies. And I can tell you, insurance companies in particular, we deal with a lot of very complicated technology, a lot of legacy technology. We've got 20, 30-year-old mainframe systems that a lot of people barely understand how they work on a good day. But then when you start talking about doing things, well, let's expunge this record. Well, what's going to happen to the referential integrity of your database and all of this? These are real things that we have to think about. So it's not even just will we do it, it's can we do it, and what kind of investment do we need to make in our technology to allow these things to happen?
And on the flip side of that, it's not just legacy IT. As much as there is a global sort of digital transformation that's occurring, that every company is taking their infrastructure that is used to be these legacy servers and now moving it to cloud service providers and software as a service, and we're seeing this great race towards CSP and SaaS-based solutions. But that doesn't make sort of compliance with GDPR any easier, because now you have to take a single file or the Evan Wolf record at Zurich, and you have to remove it from every single cloud instance that occurs. And this is where, the tools, the data management tools, this isn't always a security thing. It's sometimes just an IT thing, aren't exactly there. It's the exciting part of I guess what we all do up here is that, we get to watch as the technology, the rules, the regulations, and the threat actors all come together at once sometimes. Yeah.
Yes, sir, in the middle.
Douglas White with CRDF Global. I'm presently working a lot in Ukraine on some cybersecurity capacity building and training efforts. And any work in Ukraine sort of involves one particular threat actor. I wanted to circle back to a comment that you made, Mr. Kudelski, which was about a cybersecurity Geneva Convention. And I think that's very curious, and I'm very interested to learn more about that. Could you characterize where you see that sort of movement is today and how you would imagine that going forward? I mean, I'm thinking in terms of, before Reykjavik, we were never so far apart as we were between the U.S. and Russia. And how do you see that going forward, and what stakeholders are involved in that so far, and what are they thinking today? Thank you.
So, thank you for the question. I have seen first some authorities within Switzerland being interested at that, and especially at the level of the canton of Geneva, but actors like, for example, Microsoft are very interested to go in this direction. So fundamentally, I have seen that there is some appetite from the tech giants to go in this direction, but maybe some extra, incentive at governmental level would make sense. Now, sometimes it's something pretty sensitive because at the same time people are friendly towards something that is more international, but on the other side, and that is pretty natural, that the ones that have a competitive advantage do not want to lose this competitive advantage. And I will just give you a very simple example. Before the Brexit, there were some discussion between the UK and Europe about how much of the cybersecurity defense strategy should be done at the European level versus at the national level. And UK was more looking at doing that at the national level. So don't forget that in the cyberspace, you have also a question of who wants to keep a competitive advantage. And that is pretty natural. And as it's an emerging technology, you have some countries that are much more advanced than others. You need to have an element where we can collaborate while maintaining the opportunity for different countries to keep the competitive advantage. And that is maybe the most tricky element in this discussion.
Yes, sir.
Rory McMillan from Macmillan Keck. We're a Swiss-US law firm. I want to pose a question, which is, would any of your advice change in countries which are very low income? Let me just elaborate that a little. I mean, we advise a lot of governments and regulatory authorities in Africa, Middle East, Asia Pacific, and very low resources. And some of the sorts of course, they're vulnerable. The Bangladesh bank heist, for example, is well known. But some of the lessons that we've learned about advising countries are the severe lack of human resources, yet exposure to risk, which leads us sometimes to look for solutions that are low on process and high on bright line rules. Or another might be is there mileage for less just domestic collaborative attempts and more wholesale outsourcing to very sophisticated international companies who can take care of things for a country on a wider basis? These are just ideas I'm throwing out, and I'm not really convinced by any of them. Obviously, process is vital. I think going to your point, Evan, about getting collaboration. But would any of you have thoughts on how to start with countries with very low resources, yet do have a real exposure?
Well, that's actually an interesting concept, and to be honest, I hadn't really thought of it in terms of what the private sector might provide directly to such developing countries and so forth. But I can tell you, one of the other challenges that the WEF GCC is looking to tackle, as well as this whole problem of emerging markets and underdeveloped countries, and how can we raise the level of cybersecurity talent and skills, And to riff on something that Andre said earlier as well, in talking about the apprentices, when you sort of have this vacuum of some sort of framework, one of two things can happen. People can go to the light side or the dark side. So one of the things that concerns me in these types of areas, if we don't go in and start training people and putting in the right kinds of frameworks for them to develop and grow and become more defensive as a nation and as a culture and society, what might happen? Well, a criminal element could take effect. That could be one consequence. And we've seen this happen in some countries, in some of the African nations. I think everybody is familiar with some of the countries that are well known for having some criminal elements and hotbeds of ransomware and different types of schemes. So these are the kinds of things that can proliferate unless we have some sort of approach to really take on and address this challenge. I think that's an area where it's probably not the private sector so much as it is a public-private partnership to tackle those things.
I would just like to take two examples, because in the situation you are describing, you have different options. One option is a country that is interested to avoid that there is some cyber activity, and here international help, including from some private company, is something that can work very well. We have done that in digital television in Latin America, where we have been training some local police and justice. Now, where the situation is much more tricky is if you have some corrupted governments where the government is part of the problem. And then it's extremely delicate, because you cannot go against the sovereignty of the country, but you still have the problem. And that are issues that are really not easy to solve.
So I think it's a really great question. I began my operational career 20 years ago in India and Nigeria, working on complex technology projects, and I think if there's something we could have done then that would have, if there's some secret crypto that we would have done that would have solved all the problems that we see in developing countries, and I know there's not, but I do think there are three things that we've learned over the sort of last sort of 20 years of cyber in the U.S. and some of the other countries that have been thinking about this. And the first is sort of the rules and organizations. I think having both, the rule of law is something that's been very helpful as lawyers, and have been thinking about this globally, and having sort of certain standards. I would argue not doing what we've done in the U.S., because I think things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and sort of Communications Act are not what we want to be copying. We actually can, I think, be sort of leapfrogging over some of the rules in the U.S. and having organizations responsible for this. I think, what we've learned in the development of the Homeland Security, having someone in charge makes a big deal, and if no one's in charge, then nothing's getting accomplished. Second, I do think there is a leapfrog technology opportunity, because as we've seen with companies, it's a lot easier to start a business now because of all the cloud and SaaS-based offerings out there, and I think countries can also take advantage of that. I think that there's a sort of carefulness to it. I did a couple years ago had to do a investigation into a country that lost most of its digital certificates. So that's something that we need to think about.
Can you just explain what a digital certificate is?
Sorry, that's the identity of servers that allow you to sort of know what your address is in the global world. So it's basically the equivalent of losing all your addresses, physical addresses, in a short amount of time. And then the third is really people. I do agree with both of what they said, but I would actually think that countries, especially those countries that are still developing their economies and trying to figure out what their role is in the technology world, should view this as a way of making investments in the future. And we're seeing this. I go to DEF CON every year and have for many, many years. And when I see
With the Wilson Center.
Sorry, with the Wilson Center, through the Cyber Lab that the Wilson Center runs. Sorry, Meg. And when you look at sort of that we have DEF CON in Asia, I'm sorry if I'm throwing up a little as I say that, but when we see about sort of where DEF CON and where these sort of hacker community is going, it is trying to become more global. And I think that's something that the country is just as, it was really exciting going to a Hacker Fest in Kentucky, not a foreign country, but it is exciting seeing sort of the hacker community go around the world. And this is the opportunity for countries to realize that there is a good and dark side of our community.
So we have time for one last question or a group of questions if we've got more than one. Any? Or we can wrap with that. Thank you very much to our panel, and thank you to the ambassador.